Hi, John. How are you today?
I'm good, Elliot. This is a special edition of This Week in AML. And as we mentioned in the past, we've run legacy programming during the holidays, but this time we thought we would do something a little bit different. And this one, we're going to focus on Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and their three plenaries that are concluded in 2025 and give you some of the highlights about those. And as always, for more information, go to the FATF website. They have a lot of great reports, the outcomes of the plenaries that we're going to be referring to, as well as all the recommendations that are relevant to all the jurisdictions that are part of FATF, especially as we've talked about before, those that are in the middle of mutual evaluations, which they'll be tested to see how they respond to the various recommendations. So how do you want to start here?
First, let's just set the stage. FATF has three meetings a year referred to as plenaries. Generally, over the last number of years, they've been in late February, late June, and late October. And at those plenaries, they do a variety of things. They review changes to recommendations or totally new recommendations. They review the country level reviews that have been completed. They take a look at the countries who have action plans and get recommendations from the committees related to those action plans about what the status of those countries should be, whether they have completed their action plans, they're in good progress, they're falling behind, and things like that. So when you and I spend the rest of our time talking about the plenaries, that's the context for those of our listeners who aren't as plugged into FATF as we are. The other thing, and we'll talk about that related to the June plenary, is there are a number of regional organizations that roll into FATF. And at times, including the June plenary this year, the plenary will be a joint meeting with one of those regionals. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to June. What are your big takeaways from February?
A reminder that during the 2 year period now, it used to be one, but 2 year period of the FATF president, so there's rotating presidencies. This one is the president is Madrazo of Mexico, and she has the priorities that she brings to the FATF for the 2 year period. And one of her priorities, something we talk about constantly, and that's financial inclusion. So the February plenary, from the outcomes listed on the website, they talk a bit about changes to the standards to better support financial inclusion and a risk-based approach, which is another item that FATF in general has talked a lot about. So that's one of the things there. I would mention too that throughout 2025, and it certainly was referenced back in February, that the suspension of the Russian Federation based on their attacks, war declared against Ukraine, continues to stand. And that started back in February of 2024 and all throughout the plenaries in 25. FATF reminds everybody that the Russian Federation is still suspended. But those are risk-based approach and financial inclusion are two of the things that I took. And obviously there was some other items from that February plenary as well.
Yes, there was substantial activity regarding detecting and disrupting online child sexual exploitation. That's a topic that you and I have talked about in the broader context of human trafficking on a number of occasions. And a lot of that activity crosses national and international borders pretty seamlessly. It's something that FATF has looked at seriously. And in particular, in February, they were focusing on sextortion of children. And you and I have talked about that as well. And then the last thing they do talk about is public consultations. And for those of you who listen in the US, that would be what we consider a public comment period. They talk at every plenary about which public consultations on either new recommendations, modifications, or recommendations are going on. So that as you get used to looking at FATF outcomes, it's important to see what's in flight.
Right. The last thing I saw that the FATF removed the Philippines from its increased monitoring, what they say, following a successful on-site visit. And obviously part of the FATF plenaries are always about the different jurisdictions and where they sit. And then moving on to June, as you mentioned, this was a joint FATF meeting. This was with Moneyball And there was over 200 jurisdictions and observers in what they're calling 2 days of conversation and technical discussion. Some of the outcomes that they published are they approved changes to the FATF standards regarding cross-border payments. They say that's in line with the G20 initiatives to make payments faster. And then they also said that the meeting marked what they call a significant milestone mutual evaluation, which is now going to focus on how effectively countries are combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation finance. So there is a new standard now, which the U.S. will be under as well, as we know, because their mutual evaluation, which is ongoing, will be completed in 2026.
Yes, and Canada is, I think their mutual evaluation under the new standards is starting now. So a lot of big players now coming under the new standards with that effectiveness component.
The other thing to mention, because we've talked about it quite a bit in other contexts, is during the outcomes of this plenary, new FATF procedures were agreed to deal with what they're calling stopping the misapplication of measures to protect NPOs from abuse. So remember the unintended effects on charities, humanitarian groups, when jurisdictions put laws in place or enforce those laws regarding terrorist financing and related crimes.
And in June, the plenary removed Croatia, Mali, and the United Republic of Tanzania from the list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring after successful on-site visits. Again, that's the on and off the various lists. There was also activity related to strengthening payment transparency, which is part of recommendation 16 in the FATF standards, and some additional work on financial inclusion, as you mentioned, that being one of the key strategic initiatives of the current president, where there was strengthening to recommendation 1 on a risk-based approach. Earlier, they endorsed updated guidance that empowers financial institutions and other providers to boost financial inclusion.
They also said that what they're calling their 6th targeted update was approved for publication, which came after the plenary, and that's going to assess jurisdictions' implementation of the FATF standards in relation to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers.
Yes, and that's been an ongoing theme. I would say that FATF is leading the world in terms of the virtual asset and virtual. You and I have talked about the fact that the UK and the EU are certainly fast followers, and we're seeing, at least at the moment, that the US is taking a different approach in terms of how they view the risks. We'll see how that all balances out over time. And it'll be interesting to see if it shows up in the mutual evaluation of the US when it comes out next year.
Then we moved on to October. We've mentioned some of this in our weekly conversations, but some of the jurisdictions that are no longer under increased monitoring, according to the outcomes in October, they congratulated Burkina Faso. I must admit, I have no idea where that is. Mozambique, Nigeria, and South Africa for positive progress in addressing strategic AML and CFT deficiencies that were identified during their mutual evaluations. They say that those jurisdictions have completed their action plans with specified and agreed timeframes and will no longer be subject to increased monitoring. So they further say that to sustain that improvements in those systems, at least 2 of the countries, Burkina Faso and Nigeria, will continue working with their regional bodies, and Mozambique will continue working with theirs, and South Africa, who is already a FATF member, will continue working with the FATF in coordination with theirs as well. So just more specificity regarding they're no longer under increased monitoring, but promises to work in the action plans, and then obviously with the FATF style regional bodies.
Burkina Faso is in West Africa.
There you go.
Yeah. They also talked about mutual evaluations, and they adopted the reports from Belgium and Malaysia. And these were done also under the new approach. So there was an assessment of the effectiveness of their measures. And those reports will be published later this year. And the strategic initiatives, they talked about strengthening asset recovery. When there's a loss of assets, how do the people who have been wronged get the assets back? And so the plenary adopted new guidance, which you can find at the website. And as we talked about recently after the plenary, they also adopted a new function called Horizon Scan that warns of how criminals can exploit generative AI agents and other new technologies to facilitate illicit activities, particularly in the space related to deepfakes. What else did you see there?
I think that was generally it. There's been since the plenary, there'll be some additional reports published before the end of the year. There always is what they call a call for action. So dealing with issues relating to high risk jurisdictions. I would point people to a number of the reports done throughout the year. They created this year a money laundering national risk assessment toolkit that came out in August. We mentioned the virtual assets and virtual asset service providers report that was also mid-year. And then I would point people to a speech made by President Madrazo to the UN Security Council in August, which talks about the various threats to international peace, but also mentions the importance of financial inclusion. So she has definitely made her case in other fora besides at FATF. But again, pay attention to those countries that are under increased monitoring and those that have been delisted from that, if you will. And just in general, take a look at the calendar for FATF activities throughout the year. It's not simply the plenaries. For example, as we're recording this, they just issued detailed guidance on recovering of criminal assets. They've done webinars in October on financial inclusion through the risk-based approach, and I'm sure you can watch those after they've been posted. So again, number of excellent recommendations, reports, outcomes all throughout the year that, as we are all part of this global AML world, becomes real important to pay attention to.
So, John, you have hopefully great holidays, Thanksgiving in particular, and enjoy time with family. And you and I will be back doing regular weekly this week in AML immediately after the holiday.
Sounds good. Take care. Stay safe.
You too. Bye bye.